I watched them say their vows like I had never existed. The officiant's voice carried over the sound of the ocean, and the guests leaned forward with the particular softness that only weddings produce, that collective willingness to believe in something. I sat in the 5th row in a dress I had chosen carefully, and I kept my face still, and I listened to Adrian promise Chloe everything he had once promised me. Not in the same words, but in the same general shape of things, the forever, the choosing, the particular sentence about being chosen back. I had been chosen once. For 6 years I had been chosen, and then the choosing simply stopped, rearranged itself, and pointed at someone I had trusted with everything I had. I had not wanted to come to this wedding. I held the invitation for 3 days before opening it and another 2 days before deciding to accept. What I had needed, I finally understood, was not revenge or confrontation or even the satisfaction of being seen. I had needed a room to walk out of on my own terms. And I needed someone beside me when I did it. I had found that person. Neither Adrian nor Chloe knew yet. My name is Natalie. I am 32 years old. I am not the kind of woman described in superlatives. I am not the most beautiful in the room or the loudest or the one who changes the temperature just by walking in. I am the kind of woman described, if described at all, as steady, reliable. The kind you count on and then, after a while, begin to take for granted, because the things you can always count on are the hardest to notice. Adrian and I were together for 6 years. We met at 24, when I was working through a graduate program in organizational management, and he was at the beginning of a career in financial consulting he talked about with an intensity one mistook for passion and later understood was simply ambition. Chloe had been my best friend for 9 years. She was everything I was not in terms of presentation. Bright, expressive, the kind of person who filled a room without trying. I loved that about her. I thought she loved me back in the way friends love each other. I was wrong. What I have now, 2 years after learning that, is a clear head and better company. The betrayal did not arrive dramatically. It never does, I think, when you have been in a relationship long enough for your guard to become invisible to you. It arrived through small things, a changed password that used to be shared, a name dropped in a way that was slightly too casual, the particular quality of Adrian's phone calls when he stepped out of the room. I noticed each thing separately and told myself a separate story about each one. Too much work stress. A difficult project. Privacy that everyone deserved. I was very good at explaining things away, because the alternative, the actual shape of what was happening, was something I could not afford to believe while I was still inside it. Chloe was the person I called when I was worried about my relationship. She listened. She said all the things a best friend says. She asked questions and remembered the answers. She was the person I trusted with the information that would eventually be absorbed quietly and folded into a new story she was already building with the person I was trying to hold on to. That is the part one think about least now. When I think about it, I move on quickly. The truth surfaced on a Saturday in March, 2 years ago. I had driven to Chloe's apartment to return a book she had lent me, with a note I had written inside the cover. I used the key she had given me years earlier because I had texted and she hadn't responded and I thought she might be asleep. She was not asleep. Adrian was there. The 3 of us stood in her hallway for what felt like a very long time but was probably 45 seconds, and then I put the book on her entry table and I left. I did not shout. I did not cry in front of them. I got to my car and sat in it for 20 minutes in her building's parking structure, and then I drove home and made tea and sat on my kitchen floor and let everything reorganize itself around the new information. What surprised me most was not the anger, which arrived and was substantial, but the clarity that came with it. The particular, clean clarity of a person who finally understands something they have been misreading for months. It hurt with a precision I had not expected. But underneath everything else, there was also something like relief. I had not been imagining it. The ground had actually been moving. In the 2 years that followed, I rebuilt something. Not the same thing, you cannot rebuild what was there before, and I am not sure you would want to, because what was there before contained the conditions that led to the parking structure. But I built something new in the space the old thing had left. I went back to work with a focus I had not had before. I changed my apartment until the space felt like mine rather than a shared life interrupted. I kept the friends who had shown, in those difficult months, that their loyalty was to me and not to whichever version of the story was most comfortable. I started running in the mornings. And I met someone, though not in a romantic sense, someone who would matter to this story differently, someone who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. That person was named Patrick, and he was, at the time we met, a senior partner at a firm doing work that would intersect with this story in ways I did not yet know. He was not a romantic partner. He was something I had not had before, an advocate. Someone who spoke about my capabilities in rooms I was not in yet but was working toward. I met Patrick through a professional conference I almost didn't attend. I had registered months earlier and then convinced myself it wasn't necessary. My colleague at the time, a practical woman named Vera, told me I was going and drove me there herself. At the conference, Patrick gave a talk about organizational integrity that was the clearest thing I had heard in a professional setting in years. Afterward, during the networking portion I had also been planning to skip, I asked him a question about something he had said. He answered seriously and then asked a follow-up that showed he had heard my question rather than just the words of it. We talked for 40 minutes. He introduced me to 2 people and followed up the next day with an email saying he had enjoyed the conversation and would like to stay in touch professionally. Over the following year, Patrick became a genuine mentor, someone who understood my work, challenged my thinking, and spoke about my capabilities in rooms I had not yet reached. He was not a romantic partner. He was an advocate, which was something I had never quite had before in the specific way that changes what you believe about your own possibilities. The wedding invitation arrived on a Thursday in an envelope I recognized from Chloe's handwriting. She had always looped her capital letters in a specific way I had found charming for 9 years and found something else entirely now. It was a cream envelope with my name written in the careful way people write addresses when they want the recipient to know they noticed. I set it on my kitchen table, made coffee, and looked at it. Then I opened it. Beachfront ceremony, reception to follow, evening of the 23rd. Dress code formal. And on the inner card, in different ink, "We hope you'll come." I read those 4 words many times and understood them as the particular kind of cruelty that doesn't know it is cruelty, the assumption that an invitation was a gift rather than a reminder. I thought about throwing it away. I thought about ignoring it. And then I thought about the parking structure, and the 45 seconds in the hallway, and the fact that I had never walked out of a room involving these 2 people on my own terms. I RSVP'd yes. Then I called Patrick and asked if he was free on the 23rd. Patrick said yes immediately, which surprised me. He asked if I was sure about attending and I told him the thinking I had done. He was quiet for a moment and then said it seemed like a reasonable decision and that he would be glad to accompany me if it would help to have someone there. He said it simply, without the dramatics that well-meaning people sometimes attach to situations involving betrayal. He just said yes and asked what time to arrive. That was the quality about Patrick I had come to depend on, the absence of performance. He did things because they were the right things to do. He had shown up for my work the same way, which is how I knew the quality was genuine. He also did not know the specific professional detail that would become relevant at the reception. I knew it and had registered it in passing, that Patrick's firm was the one where Adrian had been aggressively pursuing a senior position for the past 8 months, a promotion he had mentioned to mutual acquaintances as the next important thing in his career. I had not mentioned this to Patrick. It hadn't seemed like information that needed managing. The evening would unfold however it unfolded. The beachfront venue was beautiful in the way that expensive, carefully planned things are beautiful, nothing left to chance, every detail signaling an investment. White flowers lined the aisle in neat rows facing the ocean. The light was the particular golden that beachfront venues are primarily selling when they charge what they charge. I arrived early for the ceremony, found my seat, and watched the guests fill in around me. Some I recognized from my years with Adrian, colleagues, friends of his family, a few faces from events I had attended, and Chloe had also attended because she was then the person I brought everywhere. Some of those people saw me and their expressions did something complicated. The polite smile with the question behind it. The half-wave that wasn't sure of itself. A woman I had met at one of Adrian's office parties walked past and looked away, and I recognized the shape of the choice she was making. I had dressed well. Not aggressively, just well. The way I would dress for something I was taking seriously. The ceremony proceeded. I watched it happen. I kept my face composed and my hands in my lap and let it wash over me until it was finished. The reception was held in a glass-walled building beside the water that catches the last of the light as the sun goes down. I had moved from my ceremony seat with the rest of the guests, found my table, not near the head table, which was a reasonable choice and one I would have made myself, and settled in. The early part had the manageable quality of events when people are still arriving, and the noise of many conversations provides cover for individual interactions that might otherwise be uncomfortable. A few people stopped to say hello. Some were warm. Some had the expression of people performing warmth they weren't entirely sure they felt. I was pleasant to all of them because pleasant cost me nothing. I had decided before arriving that I would not be the most interesting or complicated version of myself tonight. I would be composed. I would stay for the speeches and then I would leave. Patrick had texted to say he was running slightly late, a meeting had gone long. I told him to take his time. I was fine at the table with a glass of water and the comfortable armor of a person who has decided what the evening is for and intends to hold to it. Chloe avoided looking at me directly, which I had expected. She moved through the reception with the bright, attentive energy of a bride performing happiness for every camera and guest, and she was good at it. Adrian was different. He saw me twice in the early part of the evening, once from across the room when I arrived, and once when moving between guest clusters. Both times something moved through his expression that he then controlled. The second time, he gave a small nod in my direction and I returned it with the same economy. That was all. That was exactly the appropriate amount of acknowledgement between two people who had 6 years of history and no remaining claim on each other's emotional bandwidth. The guests at my table were pleasant strangers, a cousin of Adrian's who didn't know me, a colleague of Chloe's who clearly did but was managing the situation with professional grace. We talked about the venue and the light and whether the catering was from the place they all thought it was from. I contributed to the conversation. I ate what was placed in front of me. I watched the room and waited for the speeches. The speeches began at 8:15. The maid of honor, a woman named Brooke, whom I had met twice before, took the microphone with the ease of someone who had prepared thoroughly and clearly enjoyed the preparation. She spoke warmly about Chloe, specifically and with what seemed like genuine feeling. Then her tone shifted into the particular register of wedding speech humor, the kind designed to delight the crowd by knowing a little more than the crowd does and letting that show. She said something about love finding you in unexpected places, sometimes requiring leaving your past exactly where it belonged. A ripple of laughter. A few people knew exactly what she meant and laughed with the edge that comes from being in on something. Others laughed because the room was laughing and the room wanted to be in good spirits. Brooke was clever enough to phrase it as a general truth while looking for exactly half a second too long in a direction that was neither at the bride nor at the groom. Several heads followed that look without meaning to. My hands were folded on the table. I looked at Brooke steadily, without expression, and she looked away first. Chloe took the microphone after Brooke finished. She looked beautiful and certain, and I could see she had rehearsed this moment very carefully. She thanked people in the practiced order of wedding speeches: parents, friends, the venue, the staff. Then she paused in the way that people pause when they know something they are about to say will land with impact. She said she had learned something important about herself in the past 2 years. She said the truest version of any life required honesty about what you wanted, even when that was difficult for everyone involved. She said some people simply could not keep up with where life took you, and this was nobody's fault, just the natural movement of things. She said this while looking at Adrian rather than the room, which was professionally done. But the room caught it anyway. The room always catches it. Several heads turned toward me briefly, and I was still looking at Chloe with the same steady expression I had held all evening, and then I moved my eyes back to my water glass and took a small sip. My chest was tight. My hands were still. I had known the evening would contain something like this. I had prepared for it. No one at my table spoke to me in the moments after Chloe finished. Not because they were unkind, because they did not know what to say, which is the other face of the same discomfort. The cousin stared at the centerpiece. The colleague looked at her phone briefly and then put it away. I sat in the particular loneliness of a person surrounded by witnesses to their humiliation and nevertheless completely alone with it. I thought about leaving. There was the same answer as at the ceremony: Leaving early would be the thing they remembered. Staying composed would be the thing I would know about myself afterward. Patrick had texted 10 minutes ago to say the car was 2 minutes from the venue. I had told him to take his time but was now quietly glad he hadn't listened. Not because I needed rescuing. I had been clear about that from the very beginning of this whole decision. But the room was doing something I hadn't fully anticipated. Looking at me with the settled certainty of people who believed they understood the complete story. They did not understand the complete story. Patrick was about to walk in. And that understanding was about to rearrange itself entirely. The doors opened at the far end of the hall. I heard it before I saw it, the quality of sound that shifts when a space opens to outside air. A few guests near the entrance turned first, then others. Patrick walked in the way he always walked into rooms, unhurried, without performance, with the quiet confidence of a person who has no need to announce himself because his reputation precedes him. He was dressed well, in the understated way of someone whose clothes are good without being the first thing you notice. He was also, I realized in that moment, recognizable to more people in this room than I had calculated when I extended the invitation. I had known about the connection to Adrian's professional situation. I had not fully calculated what it would mean to have someone of Patrick's standing walk in and visibly come to sit beside me. The attention that moved through the space was not small. It rippled the way things ripple when something unexpected happens in a contained room. Adrian was near the bar. I knew what his face looked like when it was recalibrating. I had known that face for 6 years. Patrick found my table without drama. He greeted me warmly but quietly, a brief embrace, a genuine "how are you," the ease of two people who know each other well and don't need ceremony to establish it. He sat down, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, said the venue was beautiful. I said yes. These were ordinary things, and their ordinariness in a room doing something other than ordinary was its own kind of statement. Within 2 minutes, a man I did not know appeared at the edge of my table wanting to introduce himself to Patrick specifically. Patrick was gracious. He spoke briefly with the man, introduced me by name, and the man shook my hand with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been told something good about you by someone they deeply respect. I thanked him. He moved on. 2 more people approached in the same way over the next few minutes. Patrick handled each conversation with the ease of someone who understood exactly what was happening and chose to respond by simply being himself, which was a form of generosity I was not certain I could have managed in his position and for which I was quietly grateful. Adrian came to the table. I had watched him approach, making his way through the reception with the careful body language of a man making a social move he has thought through but isn't certain about. He stopped at the edge of our table. He looked at Patrick first, the recognition immediate and complete, and then at me. He said hello with a courtesy that had something careful around its edges. I said hello back. Patrick looked up and recognized Adrian the way people recognize someone from a professional context, with polite, measured warmth, placing a face against a file. He said hello. He shook Adrian's hand. He said something conventional about the venue. Adrian responded conventionally. Then Patrick said, in the easy way that people say things they mean but don't need to perform, "Natalie speaks very highly of you both." He said it to the room rather than to Adrian specifically, which meant it was for everyone within earshot and could not be walked back. I had not briefed him to say this. I had not asked him to manage anything. He had simply said what he felt was true, which was his way of moving through every room he entered. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds after that sentence. In a room full of ambient noise, for seconds of pause at a table is its own kind of event that people notice. Adrian said something brief and moved on. His expression as he turned away was doing the specific work of someone who has just understood several things simultaneously and isn't sure which one to address first. I watched him go back toward the head table and watched the way he spoke to Chloe, briefly, with his back slightly to the room, in the tone of people exchanging information they would rather not exchange in public but cannot defer any longer. Chloe glanced toward my table once and then looked away. I had expected neither of them to respond well to this moment. What I had not expected was how it would feel, not triumphant, which would have required a different kind of engagement with the whole evening from the beginning. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of a calculation completing. The evening had been built around a narrative of who had won and who had been left behind. Patrick's presence, and the professional weight it carried, had introduced a variable that didn't fit. Variables like that changed the math entirely. The rest of the evening had a quality I had not predicted or prepared for. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontations, no additional speeches, nothing that would have made a good scene in anyone's retelling. But the air had shifted in the way it shifts when the story a room has been telling itself gets interrupted and has to find a new direction. The whispers at neighboring tables had a different character now. The glances toward me were different, less the sidelong look of people who know the uncomfortable context and more the open, recalibrating look of people genuinely trying to update their understanding of a situation they thought they had figured out. A woman who had walked past me earlier and looked away came to my table and said hello with genuine warmth, asking what I was working on these days. I told her. She listened and seemed genuinely interested, following up with a real question rather than just a polite one. Two of Adrian's colleagues introduced themselves and mentioned Patrick had said good things about me. I thanked them simply, not strategically, just as a straightforward human response to something kind. Patrick stayed beside me through all of it, not managing the room, just present. I left at 9:45. I had come for a specific thing and I had what I came for, and staying past that point felt like a different kind of attendance than the one I had intended. I found Brooke and said good night politely, which she received with some surprise and managed gracefully. I did not find Chloe or Adrian to say goodbye. That would have been the wrong kind of ending, requiring something from them, giving them the significance of a farewell. Patrick and I moved toward the exit in the unhurried way we had arrived, and I was aware that several people were watching. Not with the discomfort of the early evening. With something more like attention. The exit through the glass doors was quiet. The air outside was cool and smelled of ocean, and I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. Patrick stood beside me without saying anything. After a moment I said I was glad I had come. He said he was too. We walked to the car. I felt, with the completeness of something that has been building for 2 years, that the chapter 1 had come to close was closed. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just finished. I thought about them on the drive home. Not with the anguish that had characterized the first year after the parking structure. That particular circular thinking that doesn't lead anywhere new. I thought about them with the clarity that had become my primary relationship to the whole history. I thought about Chloe's face at the moment Patrick sat down beside me, and what had moved through it. Not guilt. I don't think guilt was the most available emotion for her in the middle of her own wedding with a room of people watching. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a person who has told themselves a story in which they are the main character making the bold and honest choice, and who has just encountered information that complicates that story. I did not want her to feel bad on her wedding day. I mean that simply. What happened between us was done. The account was settled. What I had needed from the evening was not her discomfort. It was my own clarity. I had it now. I sat with it the whole drive home, this clean sense of being exactly where I had decided to be. It fit well. Patrick called the next morning to check on me. He asked how I was feeling and I told him honestly. Better than I had anticipated, with a specific tiredness underneath it that felt like resolution rather than depletion. He said he was glad to hear it. He said he had found the evening interesting, which was his characteristic way of describing something more complicated than interesting, and I appreciated the understatement. He asked if he had handled things the way I wanted. I told him he had handled things exactly as he handled everything, by being himself, which was the only thing I had wanted from him and the most valuable thing he could have offered. He said something about my having done something difficult with unusual grace, and I told him I had learned it from watching him work over the past year. He made a small dismissive sound that meant he accepted the compliment without needing to expand on it. Then we talked about a project I had been developing and he offered to introduce me to someone who might be useful going forward. This was how it worked between us, the personal and professional adjacent, each informing the other in ways that made both better. The story spread through social circles the way these things do, not as a broadcast but as a murmur moving outward from people who had been in the room and needed to process what they had witnessed. I heard fragments through mutual acquaintances over the weeks that followed. The image that seemed to travel most consistently was a compressed version of the evening. Brooke's comment, the moment the reception doors opened, Patrick at my table. Each retelling emphasized different elements and added its own interpretations. In some versions, I had engineered a deliberate comeback. In others, the emphasis was on what Patrick had said about my character. In at least one version, I had apparently said something pointed to Adrian that I had emphatically not said and would not have said. I did not try to correct these versions because I understood that the stories people tell about other people's experiences are about those people's need for narrative shape rather than accuracy. What had actually happened was simpler than any circulating version. I had walked into a room on my own terms and walked out the same way. That was enough. It had always been going to be enough. 3 months after the wedding, I heard through someone adjacent to Adrian's professional world that the promotion he had been aggressively pursuing had not materialized. I did not feel clean satisfaction about this. It was possible that Patrick's presence at the wedding had complicated something in professional circles I was not part of and could not see. It was equally possible that the promotion had simply not worked out for reasons entirely unrelated to anything that happened that evening. What I knew for certain was that Adrian's professional trajectory was no longer my concern or my responsibility, and sitting with that knowledge felt completely different from how it had felt 2 years earlier, when his ambitions were things I thought about with the investment of a partner building a shared life. Now they were information, like weather in a city I no longer lived in, something I could receive without needing to respond to. Chloe's image had also shifted in certain circles, the quiet social recalibration that occurs when people receive new information and update their picture of someone. I did not seek this out. I did not track it. It arrived as ambient information and I let it pass through without holding on to it. What I understand now, that I did not understand in the parking structure, is that the loss I experienced was not what it appeared to be. I thought I had lost a relationship and a friendship in the same betrayal, which was true and as painful as it sounds. But in that same moment, I had also lost a set of circumstances that were not serving me and a version of myself that had been shrinking inside those circumstances without fully realizing it. The woman who walked into that beachfront reception 2 years later was not rebuilt from wreckage. She was built from everything that had always been there, simply waiting for the room to clear. Patrick had shown me what it looked like to move through the world on the basis of what you actually were. I was practicing that. Still practicing. The reception was not the moment my life changed. My life had been changing in the 2 years before it. That night was simply the moment the change became visible to a room that had once decided what I was. They had been wrong. And the most important thing about that is not that it hurt, although it did. The most important thing is that it stopped being the truth long before anyone else noticed.